In 1989, Doctor Who aired what would be for many years its final episode. Andrew Cartmel, script editor, said moving us from Saturdays and putting us up against Coronation Street was like putting an infant on the M1 and leaving them to walk across. We were doomed. We were sent out on a suicide mission. And while the official BBC line was, let's give it a rest and bring it back in a few years' time, it was generally seen by fans as the BBC finally getting its long-standing wish to kill off the show entirely. However, as with a lot of science fiction franchises, the fan base was too big and too passionate to allow that to happen. And while protests and letters of complaint were sent to the BBC and were ultimately ignored, Doctor Who didn't die. In fact, Doctor Who came back stronger than it ever was on television. There were more stories produced. The quality ended up being higher, arguably, than certain points in the show's history. This is the story of that era. An era which is controversial, and I've noticed in more recent years has become a bit of a target for jokes and ire, and I personally think this is incredibly unfair. It's an era which contains my favourite run of Doctor Who stories in any format. It's the Virgin New Adventures. So welcome to the Library of St. John the Beheaded, a series in which I will discuss the Virgin New Adventures and hopefully put a case forward to defend them as a worthwhile and frequently excellent entry into the Doctor Who pantheon. To be honest, if you want a more eloquent defence of the Virgin New Adventures, then Anthony Wilson and Stacey Smith's Bookworm Volume 1 is worth a read. I took some of my information from that and a huge range of sources which you can find listed below. But a lot of this will not just be research but also opinions and feelings on the books, and while the series doesn't necessarily start brilliantly, by the end it will hopefully be a chance for me to put forward why I think the Virgin New Adventures contains some of the most bold, inventive, original and high quality storytelling ever released under the Doctor Who name. And also perhaps just counter some of the received opinions about the Virgin New Adventures, that they were immature, unnecessarily edgy, frequently very self-indulgent and nonsensical. I think these criticisms are fairly aimed at some of the earlier books in the line, but certainly the second half of the range I don't think is really deserving of any of those criticisms. And hopefully as a result, maybe some people will be inclined to check out some of the books. But before we get on to the Virgin New Adventures themselves, there's a little bit of background and 3 particular books which I feel are worth approaching almost as a prologue. The book range, of course, has its roots in the Target novelisations. The first ever Doctor Who fiction book was the Dalek book, published in 1964, but it was in the mid-60s where novelisations, which are heavily changed from the TV versions, especially in the case of Doctor Who in an exciting adventure with the Daleks, were published. However, it wasn't until the early 70s that the W.H. Allen owned Target imprint started publishing Doctor Who. It started out with a few novelisations of stories from the John Pertwee Third Doctor era, and moved on to the Fourth Doctor with Tom Baker. These early novels are actually some of the best in the range. The writers weren't simply putting he said, she said into the script, but they were writing entirely new books, sometimes heavily changed from the original script. Doctor Who and the Cave Monsters, the adaptation of the Silurians, is a case in point. It's a story which alters several beats of the television story. If I remember correctly, the creatures are never referred to as Silurians once in the entire book. There are others from the 70s which have some significant changes, but for the most part the targets settled down into a routine of being broadly the same as the script, sometimes based on the original script rather than the final television draft, and some writers were freer with the script than others. But particularly from the hand of Terence Dicks, who found himself in the late 70s right through the 80s to be in charge of assigning authors to the range, and in many cases failing and so writing them himself. The books were fairly straightforward adaptations. Target also bought the 3 stories from the 60s and included those. By the end of the 1980s, Target had become almost entirely a Doctor Who range. The original stories and novelisations of other children's television that it was originally known for had begun to peter out, and Target was basically a Doctor Who imprint by this point. Between 86 and 87, Virgin Publishing bought W.H. Allen in stages, and this meant that by the end of the decade, Virgin basically owned the publishing rights to Doctor Who. The novelisations were incredibly popular, sold very well. More than 125,000 copies of Genesis of the Daleks were sold, and for the entire range, internationally, in history, they're estimated to have sold 13 million copies. However, they never succeeded in publishing original material. There were 2 original novels, Turlough and the Earthlink Dilemma and Harry Sullivan's War, both based on past Doctor Who companions, neither of whom did particularly well. Peter Darvill-Evans, editor of the Virgin New Adventures and initially editor of Target books, concludes that the reason these didn't sell well was simply that there was no Doctor in them. When Target published 3 stories from the cancelled season 23, as well as adaptations of radio stories, so basically stories that the majority of readers and viewers would not have known, they sold as well as any of the other Doctor Who books, so the Doctor Who name was what was selling. Plans for original Target fiction go back much earlier. Initially, Nigel Robinson, the range editor in the mid-80s, was the first to ask if they could publish original Doctor Who fiction. But as anyone familiar with the history of the show will know, both John Nathan Turner and the BBC's attitude towards Doctor Who and its promotion in the second half of the 80s particularly were odd, questionable to say the least. Peter Darvill-Evans was initially, he was originally employed by Games Workshop, and he ran their White Dwarf magazine, he wrote game books, managed the magazine distribution, and he took this work on to something more creative, and he took over from Nigel Robinson as editor of the Target line. However, around the time that he took over was the time when the number of books began to thin out a little. Almost all of the television stories had been novelised by the late 80s, and with the oncoming cancellation, or hiatus as it was said at the time, there were very few stories left to write. Darvill-Evans was appointed as an assistant part-time editor of the range in February 89, initially to supplement his burgeoning career as a freelance writer. And he credits spotting the error on the Delta and the Bannerman spine, in which the story was called Delta and the Banner Man, as the key to getting the job. He had to learn from the ground up with no real help, resulting in him getting fully up to speed just as the show disappeared from TV and the Ranger's material dried up. There were plans to publish some more stories from the missing season 23, but these had stalled, meaning there were very few stories left to publish. Among these were long overdue Dalek stories from the 60s, including the 12-part epic The Daleks Master Plan, and these were eventually written by author and fan John Peel, who had struck up a friendship with Terry Nation, and the two had written the official Doctor Who and the Daleks book in 1988. Peter Darvill-Evans put in his own request to publish new novels on the 9th of March 1989, and it wasn't until the end of the year in the autumn when John Nathan Turner finally approved. He realised the chances of a new series being commissioned were next to nil, and decided that the show could continue in written form. John Nathan Turner even oversaw the range's development at BBC Worldwide's request. Clearly at this point Virgin Publishing were not completely trusted. The company itself was renamed from WH Allen to Virgin Publishing in early 90, and at the same time there was a huge internal shake-up which was accompanied by the shedding of most of the company's staff, resulting in the loss of most of their editors and almost all the writers. With Darvill-Evans in charge of the publisher's two most profitable ranges, which were Doctor Who and erotic fiction, and only working part-time, economics meant that he was sitting on the only safe seat in the house. With plans to make the new adventures on the horizon, he wanted to ensure Doctor Who was kept alive, realising that there was potential success to be had in the near future. That year's novelisations included the whole of season 26, as well as Ben Aaronovitch's season 25 highlight Remembrance of the Daleks, and these books were clearly written and edited with the new adventures in mind. While most of them enjoyed more freedom, both in terms of length and tone, exploring more of the darker side added to the Doctor's character in the final 2 years of the show, and fleshing out stories like Ghostlight, which had been butchered in the edit, it was the Curse of Fenric, Battlefield, and especially Remembrance of the Daleks that pointed to the future. Remembrance of the Daleks is almost a prototype Virgin New Adventure, and of any of the target novels, it's the one that I would strongly recommend, reading before starting. It's a much better starting point than Time Worm Genesis. It's just a much better book than Time Worm Genesis. It sets up a couple of threads which would be used within the Virgin range, and honestly, it's just a fantastic book. Mike Tucker, the effects designer on the show and later a Doctor Who writer himself, suggests that Ben Aaronovitch had lots of great ideas, all of which were outside a Doctor Who budget, and that really shows in the novelisation of Remembrance of the Daleks. Aaronovitch himself said one thing was certain: it wasn't simply going to be the script with he said or she said added at the end of each line of dialogue. My characters were going to have an interior life, and my fictional worlds would have some depth. He was inspired by some of the earliest of the novels, particularly Malcolm Hulke's novelisation of Colony in Space, published as Doctor Who and the Doomsday Weapon. It was one of the earliest ones, and one of those that was written as a standalone novel rather than simply a direct translation of the script into prose. Peter Darvill-Evans gave Aaronovitch unlimited word count and encouraged the book to be more adult-oriented. And it's fairly obvious from the start that this is not simply a tie-in book written to make a bit of extra cash. It's intended to be a creative work, a novel in its own right. All the chapters are named after the day and time that they happen. For example, Friday 1603, Saturday 1550, and so on. Immediately showing that the format is slightly more unusual than your average novelisation. And the prologue itself is quite surprising, because it actually takes place just before Ian and Barbara meet the First Doctor. It's written from the First Doctor's perspective, and it sets up the story. It sets up the idea that the Seventh Doctor is coming back to pick up something that he left off many years before. It shows immediately that this is a bold and daring novel, something that ties together elements of the show's history. The first chapter itself introduces us to a scheming Doctor, one who already has plans for the entire story. He knows what's going to happen, and explains why he's keen to get to know the countermeasures team. There are several elements of this book which really do set up things which would become staples of the Virgin New Adventures. There's focus on the colour of the Doctor's eyes. There's the Doctor being strangely manipulative, not in a huge chess player kind of way in which the character is sometimes portrayed, but just by his presence. Reality began to creep in at the edge of Rachel's perception, and only then she realised how clouded her mind had become. "Excuse me?" The man looked up. "Yes." "Who are you?" "I'm the Doctor." He extended his hand and Rachel shook it. His palm was cool. "I'm Rachel. Professor Rachel Jensen." That introduction alone shows that Jensen is heavily affected simply by the Doctor's presence. It's a scene on television where the Doctor simply jumps into the countermeasures van. She accepts him straight away, but here it's given some background, it's given her an explanation as to why she accepts him, and that's because he has an almost hypnotic power on her simply by being present. Similarly, an angry Alsatian is quelled simply by "shush," said the Doctor. The Alsatian's eyes grew puzzled. The tension left its body and its head drooped guiltily while its tail wagged in low, hopeful arcs. "Don't worry about it, dog," thought Ace. "He has the same effect on me." So that also shows that it's not just when the Doctor is face to face with adversaries and things that could potentially damage him, but it's even around his companions. He has this effect where he can calm them, even effectively kind of numb them, which is quite scary. It's a side of the Doctor that not really been seen. He was always seen as a very a kind, friendly, easygoing character. All the prior incarnations of the Doctor, perhaps with the exception of William Hartnell's first Doctor, but they're generally seen as friends. Whereas here, there's something standoffish and something controlling and manipulative about him, even to a companion like Ace, who on screen has one of the best chemistries with her Doctor out of any Doctor and companion pairing. There's also this paragraph. A quiver of anticipation ran through the warrior as his battle computer verified the data. Desire ran hot through sluggish veins, its internal life support compensating for the sudden demand on blood sugar. There was a high probability that this was the Doctor, the Karfarak Gatri, the enemy of the Daleks. Karfarak Gatri was a name the Doctor was given by the Daleks. It was used a few times throughout the Virgin New Adventures. He's also referred to as Bringer of Darkness. That section is from part of a chapter which is written from the perspective of a Dalek, which is something that is, to the best of my knowledge, is unique to this novel. There are several chapters written from the perspective of different Daleks, as well as sections written from the perspective of the Hand of Omega itself. Again, this is not simply a straightforward telling of a story. There are parts which are just incredibly different to anything you'd expect from Doctor Who, especially something based on a TV Doctor Who story. There's an attempt to add depth, to add perspectives, just to add an entirely new slant on the entire franchise here. The most memorable section is, of course, the Abomination, which is the name that the Daleks give for the special weapons Dalek. It having a name marks it out as special in itself, and the feedback from its weapon, radiation flooding backwards every time it fires, means that the Dalek is mutated well beyond any other Dalek and has become very much self-aware and an individual in the way that the drone-like Daleks are never portrayed. It's feared by other Daleks. We also get a section written from the perspective of Davros as a child and then a young adult, witnessing the accident that caused his mutations, that caused his disability. And again, this is just a level of characterisation that would never have been written before this point. There are also just beautifully written little sections. A kilogram of Nitro-9 exploded 8 metres behind him. Luckily the ground broke his fall. He stayed where he was, his eyes focused on the dirt in front of his face. Then he noticed 2 ants fighting for possession of a tiny fragment of leaf. It's just a brief section written from the Doctor's perspective, which again was very unusual. Adds nothing specifically to the plot, but it's a beautiful little detail. Chapter 3 opens with an excerpt of The Zen Military, a history of UNIT, written by Cadiatu Lethbridge Stewart, which sets up a character and a plot arc from the Virgin New Adventures. And the third chapter closes with a section seemingly out of the blue, written on ancient Gallifrey. The triumvirate meeting a gallery high in the upper hemisphere. Of these 3 Gallifreyans who would reshape their world, 2 were to become great legends, the other would vanish altogether from history. The 3 legends were Rassilon, Omega, and an unnamed other character, here just referred to as the other, as a description rather than a name. But this again would feature heavily in the ongoing Cartmel Master Plan arc, which informs some elements of the Virgin New Adventures. It also introduces concepts like the dark time of Gallifrey, the fact that Rassilon and Omega were cousins. There's elements of the Doctor wanting to give up this life, and he says softly into the night, "Don't you think you could just get on without me, just for a little while?" Something that the early New Adventures would build up on. With the loss of Omega, Rassilon is determined that there will be no superstition at his death, which once again feeds into the Gallifrey plots and the New Adventures. And we get a little more in the way of Ace realising her sexuality in an internal conversation where one part of her is prodding her to chase Mike. All the soldiers that we meet, including the main characters, carry internal trauma from past experiences of fighting in wars, which adds a certain bleakness to their characters. Generally on television, the soldiers, whether they were one-off characters or unit characters, were either professional or easygoing and friendly. They didn't carry trauma and anxiety, but this is something that we'll see a lot of in the novels. It's actually very common in the prose versions of UNIT to see this kind of thing really sometimes taken too far, especially in the missing and past Doctor adventures. Aaronovitch includes a detailed analysis of the effectiveness of the FL NAL automatic rifle, which seems somewhat unnecessary, but it gives an idea of how much Aaronovitch likes to research his topic. Overall, the idea of racial purity is taken a lot further in the novel. It's an underlying allegorical aspect of the TV version, but it's brought right to the surface with John in the cafe discussing his family history of slavery, Jensen dreaming of her childhood experiences as a Jew in a synagogue, and Ace dreaming of the attack on Manisha and her blowing up a wall covered in racist graffiti. This is actually the origin of Manisha's house being burnt down, which Marc Platt, having read an early draft of this, ended up writing into the story of Ghostlight. It's an extremely rare example of a novelisation actually adding to the TV lore. Ratcliffe is expanded from simply a traitor to become a full-on reactionary right-wing neo-Nazi, spreading conspiracy theories about banks and communists running the world, and people of other races, Jews, black people and so on, coming to take over, which is sadly something which still happens in conspiracy theories and even mainstream right-wing propaganda to this day. There's even a reference to the Time campaign, the war to end all wars, which isn't the only reference to a time war in the novel range, and almost certainly has nothing to do with the one created by Russell T Davies for the renewed TV series, but it is an interesting aside. On the subject of the TV series, the Civil War here is very blatantly about racial purity, and is something that had begun in the previous story, Revelation of the Daleks, with Davros making his new Daleks out of humans, but it isn't fully developed until here, and especially so in this novelisation. In the Revival TV series, this idea of racial purity would come to define the Daleks and their motivations, and this is another case of this final era of the classic series going on to become incredibly influential. There's more of the new series in this book alone than the entire Eric Sayward era of the show. One could argue that Davros's recklessness with his changing Daleks' genetic makeup is a betrayal of his initial goal of saving the Khaled race, and represents another step in the deterioration of his character towards a generic, maniacal dictator, although it's equally as valid to see it simply as an extension of his initial idea of mutating his people beyond recognition. Without Terry Morroy's very unsubtle performance, the book lends the character more depth and believability than the TV version. One of the most memorable sections is the destruction of Skaro, which is seen not from the distance through a conversation with the Doctor and Davros, but from the perspective of Skaro itself. We have creatures there, living, wild animals, out in the plains of the planet, which highlight that this is a living ecosystem and not simply, a Dalek base that's being destroyed. Under the plane of swords, the beetles stirred in their nests. In the sky above, the sun changed. 1,000 million Daleks stopped. The rock leopards in the mountains howled in terror. The sky turned white hot. 1,000 million Daleks cried out in defiance. Then the seas boiled, the metal cities of the Daleks ran like wax, and the atmosphere was blown away into space. Skaro died. It's not all bleak, there are moments of humour. Possibly my favourite line in the entire book is, for one vertiginous moment, the Dalek Supreme wanted to skip. The idea of a Dalek skipping is incredibly entertaining, and there are nice little droll moments. A section which opens up with Jensen sipping some coffee, finding out it was cold. She goes through a conversation with the Doctor, and then it ends. She took up another sip of coffee. It was still cold. It's not a perfect novelisation. Without knowledge of the TV version, it's not actually that easy to fully identify and understand the two Dalek factions, especially as they are apart for most of the books. You don't see them fighting each other, you just get periods where a Dalek is moving around, or we see something from the perspective of a Dalek, but not often enough is it made clear which side the Daleks are on. On TV, obviously, this has helped because you have the white and gold Daleks and the grey and black Daleks. It sort of suggests that a strong familiarity with the TV version is definitely necessary to fully enjoy the book. But overall, that's a minor niggle. It is a fantastically written book. It has a few trappings of children's TV and children's writing at the time, but it's definitely aimed at a much more mature audience, one who will understand the longer words, appreciate the different perspectives, the moral ambiguity, some of the references, and who'll enjoy the history, the additions to the Gallifreyan backstory, and will just enjoy the frequently quite heavy-going, dark elements. It's a fantastic book. It's by far the best Target novelisation, to the extent that it was part of the BBC Doctor Who 50th anniversary collection, in which stories for all 11 Doctors at the time were reprinted, one for each, and every single one of these was an original novel, most from the past and Missing Doctor adventures and a couple from the new series adventures. The only exception was the 7th Doctor, a Doctor who had an entire book range to his name, and yet they chose the Remembrance of the Daleks novelisation. And that isn't a slight on the Virgin New Adventures, but that just points out how fantastic and how influential this book is. I'll go so far as to say if you only ever read one Doctor Who book, this would be as good a place to start as any. The other notable novelisations are Battlefield and The Curse of Fenric. Neither of these is anywhere near as influential or as important as Remembrance of the Daleks. It's fair to say that the entire McCoy era probably does better on page than it does on screen. By this point the budget had gone down to about 17p. The BBC outside broadcast cameras made everything look like it was being filmed in the Blue Peter garden. Kev McCulloch's music frequently bringing to mind the image of a slightly demented man sitting in the corner bashing away at a Casio keyboard. Without the production issues, and frequently with a little bit more depth to the writing, the era has some of the best novelisations that Target published. Battlefield opens with a prologue set in the parallel universe from which the invading Arthurian characters of the story come. Merlin's very explicitly the Doctor here, as if the references in the TV version aren't enough. Here he has two hearts, He looks different, usually younger, every time he appears, and lives what's described as a temporally haphazard life, something that has been skewed into the idea of Merlin living his life backwards. His words are very doctory, a sparkling cheekiness mixed with a world-weary knowledge and irritation of being misunderstood. And if that's not enough, as King Arthur succumbs to his endless sleep, he even murmurs, "Thank you, Doctor." There was a figure standing at the front of the slab, silhouetted against the light. As the king's cortege crossed the floor, the footsteps echoing back at them, the figure stretched out its arms in greeting and stepped backwards into the pool of light. The king caught his breath in disbelief. "Merlin, against all hope!" The wizard smiled impishly at his aged royal pupil. "I see you've been killing people again, Arthur. Another fine pickle you've got yourself into." "A once and future king?" complained Merlin. "Dear, oh dear, I thought we'd given up on all that nonsense." He shook his head of unruly red hair in irritation. "Isn't enough ever enough?" There's more than a little of the Seventh Doctor to this character, this Merlin incarnation, but the unruly, wavy red hair is something that will come back in the Virgin New Adventures. And the last one of note is the Curse of Fenric, which again runs like a more interesting, more in-depth version of the TV story. It's closer to the extended cut that was released on VHS. But the notable chapter here is the epilogue, which takes place in Paris 1887, where the Doctor is telling Dorothy, instead of Ace, about helping King Louis with his gardens. Ace herself is in love with Sorin's great-granddad, and the Doctor is just visiting, suggesting that she's long since departed and is now living in 19th century France. Again, it's just a small thing, a quick sneak preview of the future, but it's something that comes back in the New Adventures in a very tidy way. To keep things ticking over, while the New Adventures were being set up, Darvill-Evans came up with the idea of reissuing older books with contemporary art to coincide with the story's video releases. With very little overview at Virgin and a certain amount of disinterest from the BBC, these reissues managed to successfully keep the brand alive with almost no new material. The final new Target book came out in early 1991, a desperate attempt to novelise the awful Fourth Doctor audio story The Pescatons and Marc Platt's adaptation of Battlefield. The remaining novelisations released in the 90s weren't published as Target, with Darvill-Evans rightfully noting by that point that the Doctor Who brand was strong enough in its own right, and that with the advent of the New Adventures and a lack of new episodes, the franchise audience was no longer children. Indeed, there was an internal tension within Virgin Publishing as the company expanded about the fact that the Virgin logo wasn't even included on the original New Adventures spines. Peter Darvill-Evans wanted the brand to simply be Doctor Who, and as a brand it was remarkably successful, but that's a story for another video. In setting up the Virgin New Adventures, Peter Darvill-Evans met with John Nathan Turner, and he suggested starting it right at the end of Survival, with Ian Briggs picking up where the last story left off. Andrew Cartmel was brought on board to discuss elements of the Cartmel master plan and where the series could go, although later has gone on to say he doesn't recall having any conversations with Evans at the time. Darvill-Evans was also uninterested in publishing stories featuring past Doctors. The idea was this was going to be moving forward, a future, forward-looking version of Doctor Who. By now he'd devised a rough arc for what would be the first 4 original Doctor Who novels. The original idea was the Master was in the TARDIS, and he was going to split Ace into 5 parts which the Doctor must collect. John Nathan Turner didn't like it. He was still thinking of Doctor Who as a children's series and felt it was too dark, felt it was too complicated for children. Then came the idea of the Time Worm. It was a recurring enemy over the first 4 books, the idea that this series would get people into buying more than one. It'd give them a hook to buy the next and the next, effectively like cliffhangers bringing viewers back the following week. At the start of 1990, an outline of the New Adventures was published. Peter Darvill-Evans also had one eye on the wider non-Who universe. Numerous internal documents were made with writers outlining concepts, both in universe and in terms of writing and publishing, and Darvill-Evans was keen to make this a strong standalone universe which could expand beyond Doctor Who. Initial requests were sent out to a lot of the authors of the best novelisations, and writers like Peter Grimwade and Eric Sayward. Also, the Doctor Who fanzines were informed of all the news and updates on the development of the series, which resulted in Virgin getting lots of submissions from fan writers. The Time Worm proposal was completed in April 1990, and by this point nobody at the BBC was really that bothered, so Darvill-Evans wrote the contract for the licence himself. This allowed the authors to keep ownership of their own characters, although they were allowed to be used throughout the Virgin New Adventures. The BBC simply signed this contract without really caring, which worked brilliantly for the authors. The American author John Peel, of the Dalek novelisations fame, was commissioned to write the first book, Genesis, set in ancient Mesopotamia, while Terence Dix, the former Target editor Nigel Robinson, and fan writer Paul Cornell were later pencilled in for the remaining 3 instalments, Exodus, Apocalypse and Revelation. The idea reflecting the structure of the Bible to an extent. It was a very bold, far-reaching concept, but it showed that this wasn't simply some basic new stories. This was going to be an exciting new series. The covers were briefed to be like movie posters, simple, bold, memorable, striking images, and the early promo sheet that went around used the phrase, "Doctor Who finally grows up." Eventually this tagline was changed a little bit into "stories too broad and too deep for the small screen." And so the Virgin New Adventures began, and a new era of Doctor Who was ushered in. Over the next several weeks, I'll be discussing all 61 Virgin New Adventures, and maybe some other books as well as they come along. I'll see how it goes and see what I feel up to. But I hope you come along and join me in the series and that you enjoy the videos. Please do feel free to comment, give me your ideas and thoughts on the Virgin New Adventures, on Target, Doctor Who prose in general. I'd love to hear your feedback, I'd love to hear your opinions and thoughts. And I'll see you next time for Time Worm Genesis.